Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming, especially on such a beautiful night. The upside of that is the trip out here is even more beautiful. The downside is you do have to come inside for a few minutes to enjoy the talk. But I appreciate you being here, and I'm looking forward to our talk very much. We have been honored here at Schoodic Institute to host, since Tuesday morning, a meeting of the Marine Protected Areas Federal Advisory Committee. And our two presenters tonight are here because of that event and because we asked if they'd be willing to give a presentation for the public. So I usually start and erred slightly in this by introducing myself. My name is Mark Berry. I'm the president here for Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. We are a nonprofit partner that works very closely with the National Park Service on ecosystem science and learning for all ages, and often merging the two of those by engaging the public in science. And I want to mention briefly a lot of other events coming up very soon. So we have a pretty busy month ahead of us with a lot of opportunities for the public. And those get started with the Acadia Birding Festival next weekend, where our director of bird ecology is leading some of the programs, including one trip that will come over here. We have an Acadia Artist Retreat, June 5th to 11th. We have a talk back here in the evening on June 7th about the plants of Maine's coastal offshore islands by Dr. Glenn Middlehauser. And a brown bag lunch, June 16th, from the Wild Seed Project. And then talks get even closer together at that point. On June 22nd, Climate Change for Beginners by Dean Goodwin. On June 24th, another brown bag lunch on alternative fuel vehicles. And then on June 30th, a highlight, Abe Miller-Rushing, who is the park science coordinator, and Becky Cole-Will, who's the chief of resource management, will give a talk on the history of science and resource management in Acadia, reflecting on the past and preparing for the future. So how they are thinking about this year as Acadia's centennial and what we are learning and what we need to learn to be ready for the next century here in Acadia National Park. And that's very much where we focus our efforts in helping the Park Service. But tonight we're looking offshore, and that is also compatible with our priorities. Within ecosystem science, we tend to focus on bird ecology, forest ecology, and then freshwater and marine ecology. And there is a lot for us to look at offshore here at Schoodic Point. We're in a great place to do that. And our two presenters tonight are going to talk about marine protected areas and how they can help sustain both nature and people. And we have first Dr. Gonzalo Cid, who is the coordinator of international activities, and then Dr. Charlie Wahle, who's senior scientist, both with NOAA's National Center for Marine Protected Areas. So with that, I will turn it over, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And, this has been a privileged week for us. This is my second time at Schoodic. And I have to say that it was probably the perfect place to have a week of marine protected areas. So welcome. How I would say my native dialect, bienvenidos. It's a very useful language sometimes. So this week we have been talking about marine protected areas. And it's a kind of a common question sometimes, because even if most of you have heard about marine protected areas, if you have known about the benefits and also the problems that can generate marine protected areas, a lot of people may have not the quite same impression they have about national parks. Many of you are in a national park, you visit a national park, you enjoy a national park, but a lot of when we move that to the ocean and we said marine protected area, maybe not many people know what that is. It's a protected area, it's something that you don't touch, it's something that you can use, but with some restrictions, it's something that, people protect, but we have no idea what is that for. So how many of you have heard the concept of a marine protected area? Look at that. Have you ever been in a marine protected area? How do you know that you have been in a marine protected area? Well, that is one of the main problems. Marine protected areas tend to be in the water. And everything that you know, you protect, that you consider important is under the water. I mean, there's a lot of aspects of a marine protected area that is in the coastal area, that is in the shore, that a lot of people can see, but the reality is that a lot of what we protect, what we consider special, in many situations is under the water, and it's something that people sometimes don't have access to. So in many situations, or in many cases, what we have to do with marine protected areas is to bring marine protected areas to the people, so they can see, that they can appreciate how important they are. So what is a marine protected area? And I'm not quite sure about, Acadia, but there's a nice picture of this place. What do you think is a marine protected area? This morning, someone asked what is a national marine sanctuary, which is another definition or another type of marine protected area, but this is a general concept. This is the umbrella concept. What do you think is a marine protected area?
Area where you don't allow fishing and try to restore it to its natural, original.
That is a type of marine protected area, but it's true. I mean, that could be the definition of a specific type of marine protected area, but it can be beyond that. A marine protected area really is areas that we conserve for many reasons. I mean, it can be for management purposes, it can be for conservation, it can be that we are limiting the activities of some of the activities that actually happen in the ocean. There are many, many types of marine protected areas. And they go from the ones that you don't touch, you don't do anything. They are there to preserve the ecosystemic characteristic of that part. And the reality is that most of marine protected areas actually, you can do a lot of things in there. You can fish, you can allow tourism, you can allow other type of activities. The reality is that most of marine protected areas, not just in this country, but around the world, allowed to do many things in them, under certain restrictions, of course. Now, marine protected areas have different, as I said, definitions. They are located in different places. In the United States, there are about 1,700 different types of marine protected areas. And around the world, and this is a number that I'm not quite sure, but the last time I heard it, there are about 8,000, which is a number that is probably too low, too little, compared to, what really happened around the world. But the reality, even if that number seems to be really big, only a very small portion of the ocean is actually protected. And this is the first thing that you actually need to keep in mind. Even if the South Marine Protected Area, the number of marine protected areas, of the sizes of the marine protected areas around the world seems to be large, seems to be big, seems to be repeated around the world, the reality is there are very few places in the ocean that are actually protected, fully protected. So what do we need them for? Because, what is the real need of marine protected areas? There are many reasons, really, but I would say that in general, marine protected areas help us to understand and to protect ecosystems. Before marine protected areas, conservation activities, research activities tend to concentrate just in a specific species, sometimes those are iconic species or charismatic species that people like. But the reality is that what happened in the ocean is very complex. It's a very complex ecosystem. So by protecting certain places, we are allowing the protection of ecosystems. It can also help us to have control areas in which the human activities are limited or controlled. So we know what happens when we take the human factor out of those areas. it also helps us to understand the linkages that exist between the species and their environment, and also the human with the environment. We are also part of that system. So when we take some of our activities out of the ecosystem, we know that there are going to be consequences. Consequences that sometimes are good for the environment, sometimes may not be that good, depending on what piece you take out of this puzzle, which is, a very complex marine ecosystem. In many cases, they serve as reservoirs for certain species that we are trying to protect, especially commercial species. That, by protecting a specific area, sometimes we protect those species that reproduce, and by doing that, they can, supply with juveniles of some species to other areas of the ocean. And this is especially important for areas or for certain species of commercial interest. And in some cases also, and because we are part of the system, it helps us to protect some cultural and some heritage areas that are important for our history, for our, to value, to protect things that we consider important for our own culture. And it's not just in this country, but around the world. There are many populations and cultures and, coastal populations that actually are linked to the ocean and have been linked to the ocean through history. So of course, in many countries, and especially in the United States, we also have protected areas that are there in which the main objective is to protect cultural or heritage objectives. As I mentioned before, there are many types of marine protected areas, and there are many names of which we actually know marine protected areas. You can read there, you may be familiar with some of those names. You may be familiar probably with some of the pictures that you have seen about marine protected areas that have sometimes some kind of iconic image of what ecosystems should be. But again, there are sites that are for specific purposes of conservation. There are national parks, they have a marine component. They have national marine sanctuaries that are managed by the federal government. There are marine protected areas that are managed by states or for local governments. There are specific areas that are protected for fisheries purposes as well. So, and each one of them have a different objective, a different purpose, and they are managed in different ways and managed also by different agencies as well. And as I said before, as I mentioned before, the reality is, even if we have a lot of, in number, marine protected areas, what we protect is not much. As you know, most of our planet is water. And out of that water, about probably the most recent number is less than 3% is under some sort of protection. And when I say some sort of protection, it means everything. It means everything that we protect, everything that is considered a marine protected area. Now, how much of that 3% is actually something that we preserve, that we don't touch, is minimal. It's almost zero. If you consider the entire ocean, or the entire world's ocean. That number actually changed a little bit when we moved to this country. It's still not much. What you can see in this picture is an area in the ocean known as the exclusive economic zone. I don't know if you have heard about the term before, but back in the 70s, in 1970s, all countries in the world get together and they created one of the most comprehensive piece of legislation, international piece of legislation called the Law of the Sea. And in the Law of the Sea, countries have the right to do economic activities within the first 200 miles, nautical miles, of their ocean. And the United States owns the largest exclusive economic zone in the world. Out of all the countries in the world, the United States have the largest exclusive economic zone. And out of that economic zone, that, by the way, that number may not mean a lot to you because I put it in square kilometers. Why? Because that is the right way to measure things. That number is larger than the entire United States. So the reality is the United States is more water than land. And what do we protect out of this? About, or less than 3%, or around 3% of the entire exclusive economic zone of the United States is an area that is considered no human activities. But most of this 3% that you see here is actually in this area. Let me take this one here, right here. Where is that? Huh? That's right. Do you know how that place is called? It's considered a national marine sanctuary. It's actually a national marine monument. But have you ever heard about this place? How's that? Do you know the name?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Just know it's Hawaii.
It's part of Hawaii, it's true. Well, the right name is Papahānaumokuākea. Marine National Monument. You need to add that at the end. But most of this is actually here. In the rest of all the United States exclusive economic zone, what we protect, what we really protect, is actually that number is too big, really. It's less than that. So just to give you an idea that most of marine protected areas in the United States allow other uses. They are for multiple uses. So, but there was another story I wanted to tell you about this. In order to work with marine protected areas, so the reason because we work with marine protected areas, so the way I view marine protected areas is the ocean is all connected. The ocean has no boundaries. Well, maybe one day it's going to have boundaries, or we're going to get the fish to pay for them. Who knows what's going to be the next one? But the reality is that the ocean doesn't have boundaries. And to me, it's important that when you talk about conservation in the ocean, we also have to work sometimes with other places, with other countries. And why? Because we are not alone. The ocean is connected. There are many ways the species that live in the oceans are connected. Everything that moves in the water is connected to other places as well. So what we do in our program, what we do sometimes with the federal government or with other programs or with many NGOs in the United States, we work with other places for this very same reason. By protecting other places and by protecting our places, we help each other. There are some few pictures of places that we are working with currently. One of them is this neighbor. As you know, we have open relationship with this neighbor. Cuba is probably one of the countries in the Caribbean that have some of the most pristine coral reefs in the area. What happened? Every time the coral reefs reproduce, they spawn, they release the larvae, and not just coral reefs, but many other species. Actually, most of these larvae or juveniles of some species move because the currents of the ocean, connect Cuba with south of Florida, with the Gulf of Mexico. So because this is in a very good condition, it's helping us with our coral reefs with our marine species in the area. This is a dynamic place that is connected, that moves, and of course, by working here, this is one of our national marine sanctuaries. It's called the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuaries. And right now, this area, along with the Everglades, is actually working with Cuba for the very same reason. We are connected, we have a lot of similar species, and we depend on the quality of the protected areas of this country to help us in our own protected areas. We have the same type of work in the Caribbean. This is just to give you an example. A lot of whales, especially humpback whales and right whales, they reproduce in this area because the Caribbean is better for love, and they go all the way north to feed. This is where they reproduce. This is where they feed. And one of these areas is one of our national marine sanctuaries as well. So by protecting or helping in the protection of other marine protected areas, we are actually helping our own marine protected areas. The species move in the ocean, and by protecting one area, we protect another. So we create this type of partnerships, so we create this type of networks of protected areas, because once again, working in the ocean, you cannot confine the ocean just in one place. It's all interconnected in many ways. And sometimes this connection goes beyond the areas or the point that you may think is possible. This is just a general picture of how most of the patterns of some of the ocean currents move, and you will see that they are connected in some way. This pattern changed, but this is pretty much an average. So we have also established some relationship that goes beyond, much farther beyond our borders. And some of them goes even to the other hemisphere. There are many seabirds that actually go to eat and reproduce in this area in the summer, and then they go in the other summer back to the north. And this goes not just with seabirds. There are a lot of, we have learned recently, there are some marine mammals like the blue whales that have been able to actually move from this area of the world all the way up here to Baja California, Mexico. So, and there are marine protected areas in this place that are protecting these blue whales. Same thing happened in Mexico, and it's the same case in California. So the lesson here is the ocean is interconnected. We have to work with other places. We cannot confine conservation just to one specific place, because the ocean that doesn't have boundaries. And finally, I just want to say that marine protected areas are not just all wonderful. We have a lot of problems. And when you think about marine protected areas, we need to think that we are working with people. We are controlling, we are managing people's behavior. And by doing that, we need also people. We need funding, we need money, we need agencies. Funding has been always an issue on how we manage these areas, how we do research in these areas, how we do enforcements in these areas. And of course, it's not easy. Public participation is also a key component of how marine protected areas are created and are managed. Public participation always is a very difficult topic. For something I said in the beginning of this talk, that sometimes people have I would say they have a misconception about what a marine protected area is all about, and what they could be for, or what they can help them with. The other problem is how big you think a marine protected area should be. Are we talking about small areas? Are we talking about big areas? Are we talking about multiple areas that are connected somehow? The size sometimes matter in this case, and there are many people that are going to tell you that the biggest area, the better. Some other people are going to tell you that It's not important. What is important is to protect those essential ecosystems and then protect other similar ecosystems, separated with certain distance. But this is something that we don't know much about. And we are now learning to understand how the ecosystems work in different parts of the world. I'm going to just say, limited at the end, that one of the most important challenges that we have right now, as you all may know, is climate change. Climate change is affecting our oceans. You have all heard about some effects of climate change, like the temperatures of the oceans are rising, and especially the ones that are still in school, you may know what happened when the water increased the temperature. There are a lot of physical changes in the water. All those physical changes affect the marine life in the ocean. Some of them are, changes in the pattern of the currents, but most importantly, you probably have heard about ocean acidification, and that is also another problem that is a consequence of this problem. I'm going to let Charlie to speak now because, as you can see, Charlie looks like someone that actually knows a lot. And if you have a question, if you look the two of us, who you think you're going to ask to? You're probably going to ask Charlie. But if you want any information about our marine sanctuaries or about marine protected areas, for the people in the back, you can go to Facebook and all the media. For the people in the front here, you maybe can go to our website or ask questions. So I'll let you with that, and Charlie, please.
So my name is Charlie Wahle. I'm a marine ecologist, and I work in Monterey, California, which is, the coastline looks a lot like this, actually. And I'd like to talk to you today about a couple of pieces of the story that Gonzalo told you. The one has to do with what marine protected areas really allow and don't allow. And the other is how that relates to people and how we enjoy and use those areas and how we relate to the ocean. And I'm going to do that through the lens of ocean recreation, because playing is a lot easier to talk about and a lot more fun to talk about than some of the commercial activities that get to be kind of complicated. So today we're going to talk about how people play in marine protected areas. And I mean that loosely. It's just a way of recreating. And in particular, how the marine sanctuaries sites that Gonzalo talked about, all 14 of them, manage or don't manage those activities. And you may be surprised, as I was at the end of the study, the way that they are managed and the degree to which they're not. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's an interesting thing, since the whole purpose of a protected area, really in the final analysis, is to manage human activities, right? We're not managing the lobsters themselves, although we'd like to. We're not managing the environment. What we manage, the only thing we can manage is us, right? So it becomes important that the site, the MPA, is actually managing things that make a difference. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is this whole range of recreational activities and whether they may be making a difference, and are we actually managing them appropriately. The red one? Okay. See? Okay, so there are many ways to play in the ocean. I'll just go around the clock here. One is whale watching, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Another is kite surfing, which we do a lot of out on the West Coast. Another down here is abalone diving, or any kind of scuba diving. On the far left, sea kayaking, and in the middle, big wave surfing. which is kind of a California thing. So there are, this is the beginning of the suite of things that people do. There are some more ways. Recreational fishing in the top left. This guy is also recreationally fishing, but off of stand-up paddleboard, which it turns out in some places, including a lot of the West Coast, is becoming a very common and popular thing. This person is harassing a humpback whale on a stand-up paddleboard, which is also a very common thing. Not intentionally, but that's illegal to be that close. And this person is spearfishing somewhere in the tropics. It looks like he succeeded. And in the middle, there's a famous place in the Florida Keys. The name is escaping me at the moment, but it's a party island, basically. And it sounds like fun, but it's not necessarily a good thing for the environment. People bring their boats there by the thousands and tie up and party all day long and tear up the bottom and then go away and come back the next day. So that's some pretty heavy use. And then finally, there are these other uses. These are my favorites. So this is an underwater rock concert that happens every year in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So that should give you a clue about whether sanctuaries are really prohibiting activities. This is a flaming surfer. Don't ask me what that's all about. This is the Easter parade, also in the Florida Keys Sanctuary. The Easter Bunny handing out treats to the children. This is these jetpack things that I don't know if you've got them out here yet. It's probably too cold, but it's exactly what it looks like. It's, you strap the thing on, push the buttons, and hover around until you fall and somebody pulls you out, and keep doing it until you get tired. And then this is animals getting in on the act, and it actually isn't even having fun. This is a sea lion surfing on the back of a whale in order to escape killer whales that are trying to make him lunch. So, even the animals get into it sometimes. So the serious part of all this is, this is fun. We all do it. We often do it in marine protected areas, but it raises the question of whether those activities are potentially harming the values of the area, the ecosystems, the things that we care about, and then further, whether the marine protected area is adequately managing those uses and whether it uses its authority to do that. I'll give you a hint, the answer is no. So in order to get at that question, we did a survey with SurveyMonkey, the online interactive tool, of federal marine protected areas, and basically asked them a whole series of questions, 35 some odd questions, multiple sub-questions, lots of answers. So it was a very complicated instrument, and we sent it to the three principal federal marine protected area programs, and that's NOAA's sanctuaries that Gonzalo described, and where we work, and the Department of Interior's national parks. We're standing in one, and the Department of Interior's National Wildlife Refuge System. And we had input from a lot of people, including NOAA, the Department of Interior, our Federal Advisory Committee, which is why we're here right now, and some academics in various institutions to design the survey so that it would really get at these questions. And that was surprisingly difficult. And I think maybe we made it a little too complicated. So the themes of the survey kind of fell into four big bins, and these aren't super important, but I'll just summarize them quickly. One is, which I'll talk about a little bit, is the overall trends in ocean recreation and MPA. So this isn't use by use, it's just questions like, in your MPA, is ocean recreation increasing, decreasing, stable, et cetera? And we got some very interesting answers. The next one was the big bear, which is asking a series of questions about each individual use, and we had 17 of them. ranging from people swimming to sailing to scuba diving to whale watching and all that stuff. And for each of those uses, we asked 5 questions that had a bunch of layers. So that was really complicated, but I'll show you. I'm not going to kill you with the process or the data, but I want to show you the results to give you a sense for why we would do such a thing. The third got at aspects of the marine protected areas, their placement, their size, their design, their management, that might help explain these patterns that we were expecting to see. And the last has to do with the management issues. Basically, how does the site perceive these activities? Are they good, bad, indifferent? And what do they think they should do about it? Or what are they doing about it? So I'm not going to drag you through all this. I apologize in advance that this is a little sciencey because it's got a lot of graphs, but you really don't need to read every detail. Most of the graphs kind of have a high and a low, and that's the story. But I'll try to highlight the important stuff as we go along. These are the superintendents. They're all smiling because they have good jobs. So some preliminary results, and I'm talking here only about the sanctuary portion of the 3-program survey, and the others, the parks and refuges, will come later. Here are some of the kind of take-home messages about the ocean recreation writ large. So these are not use by use. One is that it's ubiquitous, and it really is. It's everywhere in MPAs and elsewhere. And it's growing in some places in intensity and expanding in scope. And by scope, I mean the number of uses that are happening. And many of you have probably seen this in your own lives. You know, if you go to the beach, you go out on a boat, it's a lot more crowded and a lot more complicated than it used to be 10 or 20 years ago. The second is that in marine sanctuaries, and this gets back to what Gonzalo was saying about our preconceptions of what these places are really for, recreational uses often involve extractive activities, mostly fishing and some harvesting on the beach, and not always, but often involve boat-based activities, which seems kind of obvious. You're out in the water, you have to get there somehow, but it's important to consider that a lot of the way people are using these places involves a motorized boat and all the things that go along with that. Most of these activities contribute or are thought to contribute to local economies. They vary tremendously from site to site and region to region. And here's the punchline. They're generally not heavily regulated, which is a polite way of saying they're not really managed, generally. And because of that, their growth in these activities is creating some concerns among the managers who are responsible for making sure they don't become a problem. So if you kind of switch from that big macro level and you look within the sites, you see that they're seeing visitors at really astounding numbers for the ocean. They're not bigger than a lot of the land MPA or protected areas, but they come from many distances, local, 500 miles, 1,000 miles, and internationally. They use a whole range of, these are the sites, tools to manage these activities. Some are active, get out on the water and either prevent people from doing something or tell them what they should do, or passive through education and outreach and signage and that kind of stuff. They rely heavily, as where we are right now, on partnerships and collaborations with a number of institutions outside the government. And they are often hampered by a lack of scientific data to make the decisions that they need to make. And that, that's always true. It's always the more research is necessary, but this is a field that's really poorly studied and could benefit from a lot more attention. And then when you ask the managers, if you had a bag of money that just fell out of a truck, what would you spend it on? And their answer is, One is understanding the origins and meanings of these uses. Why do they happen and what are their impacts? And the other is, and this is actually, I think, their biggest concern, is educating people about what they should and should not do and how to do what they're doing in a responsible way that doesn't have impacts. So now we're going to get to the kind of the data part, but I'll keep it less painful than usual. So this slide is just a list of all the uses, all 17 of them. The top one, the orange ones, those are all extractive, taking principally fish, but other organisms out of the water. And the bottom is the percent of the sanctuary sites that report that use happening or having happened in the past. And the pattern, it's really complicated, but what it says is there's a lot of use going on all over the place. There's nothing that isn't happening. Most of them are happening in at least half the sites. One of them is happening at every single site, which is really interesting when you think about how diverse these areas are, and that one is motorboating. That's a recurring theme in this survey. And the extractive uses are pretty common, especially, of course, fishing from a boat. So this is a real thing. It's really happening. It's facing all these sites in different ways, but it's something they're going to have to come to grips with. And the same thing is true on land, of course, with people on trails and that kind of stuff. So when you ask the question, well, has this gotten more intense over time? And basically the way to look at this is the reddish bars it's increasing at some rate. And the yellow is stable, which is no change. And the green is it's decreasing. And then this color is they don't know, which is kind of embarrassing. But what you see is that a sizable percentage of the sites are reporting that their recreational activities are increasing, which is what what anyone can see if you just go out and look. But it's useful to have this documented. And just anecdotally, one of the uses that is increasing a lot and is prevalent across the system is whale watching. And in some of it is whale watching from shore. And in this picture, I think this is Hawaii, there are people who thought they were going for a surfing tournament, and they ended up watching these humpbacks surfing in the same spot. So I think that's pretty cool. And then this is the manatees of Florida, where there's a big, big issue of people basically overwhelming the area, not intentionally, but just by being there. So, you get the feeling, this kind of creeping feeling that it's a growing potential problem. This is the real gist of the whole thing. This basically is an assessment of how heavily managed the use is across all of the uses and all the systems. And you see it goes, and so the high one, the one that's the most common incidence, is that the use is allowed without any management whatsoever, active management. There's all kinds of signage and stuff, but there's nothing that would prevent you from doing, almost half of the uses. The next one, which is a sizable number as well, is management using other authorities, which is usually other agencies, that you have little or no control over. So it's better than nothing, but it's not always effective. And then the use of zoning is actually relatively, it's not common, but it's happening, and that's a good thing because it's a way of figuring out where a use is most appropriate and placing it there, basically. Permits are not very common, and flat-out prohibitions on uses are really not common. This is about 7%. So of all those activities and all the other ones that we didn't have pictures of, 7% of them are prohibited in some place, but not every place. So that's a pretty low number. And what's important about that is not that it's low, because maybe it's supposed to be low, but I'm guessing that's not what you would have expected. So that answer at the beginning that fishing is prohibited in an MPA, well, it's not. It is in some places, but not many things are prohibited, and the ones that are, probably there's a good reason for it. So then, if you look at this management level question, on this scale, 4 is prohibited, and so this is like halfway to prohibited. And these are all the different uses, and you can see two things. One is they're really different, you know, in the level at which they're managed, which that's probably rational. And the other is that some of the most intense uses, the ones that are growing the most, are managed heavily, jet skis, fishing from shore, and that kind of thing. But some of them, like surface board sports, that's the stand-up paddle boards, are not managed very heavily, and I think it's because the management hasn't caught up with the activity. So it's happening, everybody knows it's happening. I've been on endless conference calls about what should we do about this. The guys are riding up on the back of the humpbacks, but the management hasn't caught up with that yet. So part of the reason for doing this survey is to say, hey, look, this may be a problem, you ought to catch up. When you look at how they're managed, so these are things like, these are the more passive signage, web-based information, mobile apps, and then access points, citizen programs. They're all over the map as well, but there's a dominance of the things that are kind of passive. Doesn't mean they're not effective, but it means you're putting your faith in a piece of paper or a website as opposed to someone on the water saying, look, you'd be better off doing this over here where it's not a problem. And then when you ask the managers, well, how can you engage your local communities to inform them and to get them to recreate responsibly, they have a whole bunch of means of doing it. Some of you are probably involved in activities and bodies like this, advisory groups and friends organizations, and they're very commonly used. So the good news about all this is the MPAs have some tools and a lot of external support, and hopefully with the results of this survey, some insight into attacking this issue. So when you ask them, this is kind of that question about what would you spend your money on, but in more detail, but you can see that visitor education was among the top 5 priorities for every single sanctuary, which is, it's kind of interesting because there's some question about how effective that is, but that's what they rank. All right, so we're at the end now. So this will be unintelligible. It is even to me, but you're probably asking yourself, well, why would you do this? What's the point? Because it's so complicated. And this is a synthesis of all the results from each use. So here are the uses, and here are the questions we ask. How directly do you manage it? What's the current intensity? What's its trend over time? Are you concerned about its ecological impacts? And are you concerned about its impacts on other users? And the color scale, green is not so concerned or not very intense. It's a good, basically. The yellow is kind of in the middle of moderate risk to the site and its purposes, and the orange is high risk, right? And these are all kind of subjective, but it works out the way you would expect. So when you throw all those together, that allows you to do this, which is to look at the way the site manages the use versus the risk that the use poses to the site. And that's essentially management 101, right? If you manage a site, your job is to use management tools to reduce risks to that site. And that's what MPAs are all about. And when you do that and you look at the management levels from low to high, where high is restricted or permit required, and you compare it to the threats that they pose, you see some pretty interesting results. The one is that there are several, the green ones, that are pretty well aligned, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. And not surprisingly, there are things like swimming, paddling, that kind of stuff that aren't a problem and you don't have to manage them to death. The things in the middle are where a lot of people do their recreating, sailing, kayaking and stuff. But the red ones are the ones that are potentially the most risky. And they're also really common, like fishing from boats, scuba diving, motorboating, wildlife viewing. And they're generally not very heavily managed. So this is, in some ways, the roadmap to making the MPAs effective at their job, which is to reducing all these risks through management. Right? So that's where we are with this. We're going to be kind of delving into this even more to learn what we can, and then most importantly, we're going to do something with this information. Right? I mean, if you do a study like this and you just say, yay, and then you go on to the next one, which is very common, nothing happens. And if you do it and you take it to the management of the programs and you say, look at this, it's really important, nothing happens. So you have to go beyond that. And so our task now is to figure out within NOAA what these results could mean and what we can help people see and help them understand what they need to do. And then on the broader scale, when we look at the results from national parks and refuges, to do the same with the Department of Interior. And it's not that we have any control over these things, but by educating people and bringing them along, you can actually engage them in the actual solution. So that's where we are. This is not my dog, but I just love this picture. So this is our little project team. It was very small for what turned out to be a very complicated task, but that's it. So thank you for coming. I'm sure we'd both be happy to answer questions if you like.
And if you do have questions, I will run the mic to you so others can hear.
In the areas like Dry Tortugas versus Cuba, where it's less than 200 miles, how do you decide who's got the rights to the water?
That's him.
It's very simple. It's the middle line. It's actually 90 miles only between the two places. It's actually less than 90 miles because it's actually 90 miles from Key West to Cuba. But it's in places where you have less than 200 miles between countries, normally there's an equal distance line that separates the rights for both countries. So yeah, in the case of the Caribbean, in the case of the Gulf of Mexico, there are very few places that are considered open ocean that doesn't have an owner. But yeah, in that case, that has been already settled, and every country, there are very few disputes in the ocean right now, and that line is already being decided.
So I have a question about what your research is doing. So what your project team is going to be looking at with the marine protected areas.
You mean along this line?
Yes.
Well, you're looking at the project team. So the graduate students have gone off to do their thing. So part of it is designing what we do next in a way that one person can do it in a lifetime. But we're our first task, which I think is on here, is that second bullet is to do something, probably not exactly this level of detail, but some sort of analysis using the same data but for the parks and the refuges. We could do this, and we learned a lot doing this. Then it's maybe just be a matter of swapping out the data and it'll all be fine, but it may not. So we're thinking we will either do the same thing or we'll have a kind of higher level comparison. So you compare the results of the trend for each program and then draw conclusions about, not so much about the programs, but how the federal government is managing its MPAs. After that, it's kind of wide open. There are a lot of things you could do with this, and there are just a zillion stories inside of the data, you know, things that are really interesting and some that are really counterintuitive. Like a lot of the uses that people are really spun up about in marine protected areas now, like fishing, for example, are clearly not that common, you know, when you compare them to everything else. It doesn't mean they're not important, especially to the person who's doing it, but by the numbers, they're kind of a small piece of a big pie. And there are others where there's a lot of management concern, but not a lot of evidence of impact. So, you know, you could drill into any one of those things and make a very interesting study out of it.
Yeah, I was just curious. I noticed on some of the results it mentioned scuba in one of the higher risk formats. What set it into?
Yeah, that's a good catch. Because that was kind of a judgment call. The risk assessment there is it's a combination of, you know, what you would think of as risk of impact, and also just the degree to which it's growing. So scuba is just, you know, like this, and you know, there's some risk. It's not so much, and where it really is in the conflict area. But it's growing so rapidly that in itself is, we consider, it's not exactly a risk, but it's something that you really ought to pay attention to.
Are you considering it a risk to the environment or a risk to the management of the?
Well, there is, you know, it depends on where you are in the tropics. You know, with that many people, like they get millions of people a year, that most of whom are not very good divers, and you know, the coral are not healthy to begin with, so that is a risk. You know, in California, it's nothing, but what we meant by risk in that context, and that's really one of the only ones we did this with, is that it's growing so rapidly and it's totally unregulated, you know, largely, and not really very well understood.
Is there a marine protected area or park that you've found to be the highest at risk or the most dangerous right now in terms of a lot of recreation?
Well, you know, I probably should have stressed this at the beginning, but these are self-reported data from the site managers, so it's their thoughts, and I'm just, you know, writing them down. The ones that came out overall as being the most concerned and the most at risk, so to speak, are ones where there's a lot of boat-based activity. And that's Florida Keys and, interestingly, Stellwagen Bank down here because of the whale watching. And their concern mainly is impacts on the whale's behavior from all those, you know, boats buzzing around. There are others that were kind of in the tier right below that, and then there's some that, you know, seem perfectly fine and happy, and you know, they're not concerned about much. The other thing to keep in mind, and there's no way to correct for this, but you know, these are the perceptions of the managers, right? So what you're really looking at is a personality test, you know, with people who are kind of, you know, hyper and anxious and taking their job really seriously see a lot of risk, and the ones that don't. You know. So there are many ways to look at these results, but they're informative in a lot of ways.
It's also important to say that there's always risk in marine protected areas, things that can happen that are outside the boundaries of protected areas, and places that are close to urban or closer to the urban areas or close to the land, or places that are close to ship lanes, or places that are close to places we can occur accidents as well. You know, one of the most important threats to marine protected areas is actually land-based marine pollution. I mean, pollution that came from the land through the water, to the ocean. So pollution is a big risk, and it's something that unfortunately is very difficult to control from the marine protected area perspective. It's something that we need to deal with in the land management.
This question might work for either one of you, I guess. Just thinking about in the history of the Park Service, there's always this tension between wanting to encourage use because that engenders public support, right? So then more people use the parks, they see the value of the parks and support new parks and funding for parks and all that. Do you have a similar dynamic going on in your setting? I was wondering if you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I can start, and then if you can clean up if I make a mess. Yes, we do have a similar issue. Like many things, we're almost 100 years behind the Park Service in confronting and dealing with a lot of these things, but we're getting there. And frankly, the whole reason we did this survey and some other things that kind of mesh with it is to confront that problem. So the sanctuaries, like a lot of marine protected areas, they're all about multiple use and public enjoyment, and so they're actively encouraging people to come, and more so every day. And we thought it might be useful at the same time to be asking ourselves, well, what are the limits to that? And not necessarily in the numbers of people, but the ways you can control impact or zoning or whatever. So that is an explicit part of why we're doing this. The other thing we did, kind of at the same time as we started this, is our advisory committee was working on recreation issues, and they came up with what we call the call to action for responsible recreation in U.S. MPAs, and it essentially says what parks have been doing and saying for a long time, which is, yes, please come, but do it responsibly, and here's some principles for doing that. And it also directs the agencies, because it's what the advisory committee is for, how to make sure we do that. Learn this, do that. And so this is the companion piece. Is we weren't kidding. This is a growing issue. You really need to take it seriously. And that's the fundamental challenge of park-like things. It'll never go away, but I think it'll help.
A couple of slides back from this one, you had one that showed what people wanted and what the managers wanted, and there was a lot of interest in educating users. And I noticed that one tiny little one there called user fees.
Yeah.
First, that seems surprising, but then you are dealing with the open ocean. It's a little harder to put up a toll gate.
Yeah.
Have you thought of ways that any sort of use-based revenue would work?
With the exception of the woodwork part, yeah, we've thought of a lot of that. See, in the sanctuaries authority, which is really unusual, there is the legal authority to charge user fees and to accept donations and all kinds of other forms of what would typically be not appropriate funding. But there is, as you can imagine, a great resistance to being charged user fees to go in the ocean. And we have not really exercised that authority in any serious way. And there was one time, back in the 90s, I guess, where somebody in Congress thought, well, why don't you do that? They told us to do it. And so we did a workshop and a study, and we were essentially run out of town on a rail. It was horrible. And, it was all the same issues that you always hear. This is everyone's ocean and you don't own it. And, I understand that. And so it just hasn't gone anywhere. But I think maybe it's worth revisiting now. I don't know that the outcome will be any different.
And we'll make these the last two.
What do you see as the way forward?
Oh. Well, on this, I'll give you a quick answer, which is I think that we and other marine protected areas programs should start thinking more creatively about using relatively simple tools like zoning that are within the authority we already have and that aren't really onerous for people. You still get to do it. You just do it over there instead of over here to begin to solve the obvious stuff. And then for the whole bunch of it that isn't obvious, then we need to study it. But I think we need to get ahead of this before it's too late, because some of these things individually are not much of a problem really, but if they become that times 1.5 million every year, it may be a problem.
I will also add to that it seems that the oceans have always been like the younger brother of conservation or conservation activities. I think education, bringing the ocean to people is really the next step, the next frontier, how we connect people to the ocean. And it's a difficult task because even if we live in a maritime country, I grew up, I was born in the skinniest, longest country in the world that you may think everyone knows about the ocean, but no. The thing is, we don't. And a lot of people, the majority of the people, have no connection to the ocean except for going to the beach, and try to enjoy God. But that idea of connection, this idea of ecosystem, this idea that there's a lot of life under the water is still very elusive to most of people. I think it's a major task, how we bring the oceans to the general public.
On your survey or on any of your studies, have you seen any pilot programs or any of the managed areas that have had an increase in the positive environmental impact?
You don't see a lot of that. Doesn't mean it's not happening, but it's kind of like looking for good news on the TV. It's just people, they gravitate to the impact part. But I don't know how often use translates into an actual positive impact to the ecosystem, but it definitely is a positive impact on the surrounding community. When the rare cases where there are economic studies to back this stuff up, it's astounding. And so you have to trade that off with what you guys are about to experience on Monday, I guess, when everybody comes swarming in. But there are benefits, and I think that personally, I believe that many of these uses, if they're properly managed so they're not just super intense, I don't think they're a problem, ecologically. I really don't. But if there are so many paddle boarders that the sun can't get through to the seagrass, then maybe that's a problem.
Thank you both again.
Thank you for coming.
And as we perhaps head out into the lobby for a snack, I want to encourage you to, again, follow our website, schoodicinstitute.org, look for upcoming events, and think about a couple in July as well. Details will be out soon on something exciting on July 15th. And we have information out now on a July 17th Centennial Shore Seabird and Conservation Cruise. That's a joint event with Maine Coast Heritage Trust on the Bar Harbor Whale Watch boat. So that one's something to look forward to. And then a BioBlitz here, July 23 and 24. Thanks again, everybody.